Well, I think in the HR sector we've seen a number of changes. I mean, there's probably too many to mention now, but the first one I'd say is the big shift we've all experienced from drawer to computer, I might call it that. So the impact of information communication technologies and the importance of that in different ways of working and what that means for HR. So, for example, we've got organisations now with self-service portals for both staff and for management. And one of the interesting things I think about that is it's kind of sidelined HR a little bit to become a bit of a remote provider because things are so automated. So I think HR is beginning to come to terms with that, and it's something that's not specific to HR. We're all having to do it, but nevertheless, it does mean that the whole function has changed somewhat. So I think that's a big change. There's lots of people writing and thinking about it, so there's no lack of brain power on it, but actually I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges. I think the second challenge for me is that round about 2000 to 2005, that kind of era, HR was becoming much more strategic. And by that I mean it was starting to get boardroom influence and was really starting to get included in strategic decision making. And I think that started to fall away a little bit. Now there's many reasons for that, of course, but a recent survey by Patrick Wright said, well, actually what's happened is that HR split into functional and strategic, and that he reckons 85% of HR is now functional and the remaining 15% is strategic. And I think that's a story that HR professionals might actually like to listen to and take some care about, because I think HR does need that strategic voice, and I think that's starting to edge away a little bit as HR deals with all the other challenges that are happening. A third challenge, I think, is that labour and employment markets are changing quite rapidly. We're seeing an increase in, for example, casualisation of work, in particular for the young, and by the young I mean 16, 24-year-old age groups. Labour's quite precarious. We're almost in the era of seeing 0 hours contracts become normal or normalised, and certainly internships and unpaid labour are a big scene for certainly young, but not only young people, but certainly for young people. And I think those changes in those labour markets, we don't know what they're going to mean. We haven't worked through them yet, but the increasing casualisation of labour is something that I think HR will have to come to terms with, and it's a very important area of the employment market, and I think it is changing quite rapidly, as I certainly perceive things being normalised that certainly weren't normal even 5 years ago, when 0 hours contracts would have been considered an abomination. So I think the shift towards strategic is important, and that for me means that HR has to do some homework in terms of being able to gather and gain evidence in order to persuade boards and persuade senior managers. I think that's very, very important. And I think the final change I've witnessed is there's been a change from what I would call intellectual capital to performativity and performance. And by that I mean that organisations which previously used to recruit on grounds of intellectual capital, so what's your CV look like, your degree, where did you get your degree from, are now actually being changed because organisations are appointing graduates and non-graduates and often aren't discriminating between them and are looking at performance of those people and rewarding them accordingly. So you can actually find systems where graduates are being paid more than non-graduates, or the other way around. Non-graduates have been paid more than graduates, and that's based on performance. And I think that shift from intellectual capital, which was very, very important some years ago, and was itself a turning point, has now reached the end of its stream, if you like, and it's being replaced by performance. And I think that's a big, big change. So I think all of those things put together, huge challenge for HR. Well, I think the syllabus has changed dramatically. I mean, I think I'll pick these in a random order, but no intended order of importance. But I think the one thing that is important would be globalization, for example. I think a lot of HR, and why not, is based on Western capitalist economies. And the question comes, when you apply that to a faith-based economy, for example, or what's now become trendily known as post-secular society, what do? You have to look at HR in a different way, which doesn't simply rely on a notion that's borrowed probably from the States, or has been developed in the States, or has been developed through the UK, or some other Western European country. And I think that's a big challenge. So globalization is a big challenge. I think also the changing dynamics of the workplace are a big challenge. So to understand why it is that people don't see careers for life and jobs for life, and why they often want to set up their own business rather than work for somebody else, and what motivates them in terms of a value and an ownership rather than necessarily a financial motivator. Very, very important indeed. I think also our programs involve sort of almost customized content, because some organizations are really facing enormous challenges in HR, and I'd pick small businesses in particular as organizations where they don't necessarily have the resources and don't necessarily have the time and energy involved in setting up proper HR systems and professional ones. And those are organizations that need a lot of help, and they often don't get the exposure that they need. We often get the Googles and the Netflixes and the Adobes rolled out as examples of things that are changing, and yes, they are. But also we have a country dominated by small and medium-sized enterprises, and they themselves also have those kind of problems. I think the challenges for the future, there's probably 2 or 3 major ones that I would see. Of course, there's a whole number, but let me just pick 3 I think are important. One of them is to what I'd call regain the strategic ground. I think HR's lost that, as I've said earlier, and I think there's a need to regain that. I think there's also a need to keep up with technological innovation. It's true of all aspects of organisation, but in particular for HR. And finally, I think keeping up with the dynamic changes in demographics, internationalisation, and labour force changes. How do you regain strategic ground? I think HR has to start doing its homework and start providing senior managers, top management teams and policy committees with evidence-based research, not just showing what works, but how it works and why they are an asset to the organisation to be able to inform policy. And I think that's a very important thing. Keeping up with technology sort of speaks for itself, but as I've mentioned earlier, I think technology has the capacity to relegate a function often to just becoming an automatic self-service provider. And I think that's very, very important indeed. In terms of dynamic demographics and dynamic changes in the workplace, we're seeing huge extra casualisation of labour. We're seeing lots of diversity. We're seeing the increasing importance of ethics and the increasing importance of social responsibility, and the increasing use of faith-based economics and their insurgence, if that's the right word, into Western-based economics. I think taken together, that's a huge challenge, and it's an easy word to say, globalization, but it's a very hard thing to incorporate when you've got different value systems, different ethic-based systems, different secular and religious views. Those are huge challenges for HR. But really only HR can look at those, and that's what HR was originally designed to do. And it seems to me that although that's an enormous challenge, that's also something that would help HR, for me, regain the strategic ground as well as the functional ground.